Hey, ninth graders. So today I'm going to briefly go through the classwork grade from Monday and just kind of go over the right answers. Just from my class that I graded, it seemed like most of y'all were getting it. Most of y'all were getting hundreds or at least 80s or so, meaning you might have gotten one question wrong. But there were a few that seemed to be struggling, whether that's just from actually struggling from understanding Ethos, Pathos, Logos, or whether that's just from not really watching the videos and reading the PowerPoints. Either way, I'm going to go through it, and hopefully this will help make it more sense, because you will be doing things on the test next week very similar to what you did in this classwork grade. So let's go through it. So this first speech you had to read is something you've hopefully at least read before, because it's from To Kill a Mockingbird. This was the big final speech that Atticus gives to the jury in the Tom Robinson trial, right? This is his last-ditch effort to try to convince the jury that he's an innocent man. So he's using, obviously, a lot of these rhetorical appeals because he's trying to convince and persuade the jury here. And naturally, the one he mainly uses is logos. But actually, in this first question, it's this first sentence here that's highlighted. This was the first question, and it says, "But there is no witness on the scene but themselves, whose testimony has not been called into serious question and has not to be confirmed to be creditable." So the answer to this one was definitely ethos. He's definitely trying to appeal to the jury's ethos, more so by kind of calling the Ewell's ethos into question. Remember, that's something that we talked about that you can do. It's not just about the ethos of the person making the argument. It's also about, say there's a debate between two candidates, political candidates. Something they might do is call the other person's ethos into question, right? They might question whether they're reliable, whether they're trustworthy. And that's kind of what he's doing here. He's saying that the Ewell's testimony is not completely trustworthy. He's saying we can't, believe what they're saying because they were the only witnesses there. So he's saying that their ethos is kind of faulty here and it should be called into question. So the answer to number one was definitely ethos. Now, number two is this next sentence that's highlighted right after it. It says, "Moreover, the only trustable evidence which indicates that Mayella Ewell has been beaten severely by a left man's hand has completely contradicted with the defendant's situation." So if you remember back to the novel, this was kind of the big, or at least one of the big pieces of evidence in the case. It had seemed as if she had been beaten by somebody with a left hand. Obviously, Tom Robinson could not have done that. So this is definitely appealing to logos. Remember, logos is the appeal to logic and reasoning. Could be things like using facts and statistics. In this case, it's really just using evidence, right? He's bringing up the facts of the case and saying, hey, the facts don't add up, and it's clear that Tom Robinson didn't commit this crime. So that's definitely logos. And really, throughout the rest of this, you see in this speech, he really just sticks with logos. He doesn't make for the most part, any emotional appeals. He doesn't try to appeal to the jury's sense of, guilt, I guess, maybe. But he's really just laying out the facts of the case and presenting this logical argument. And that continues to be true in this last part. This highlighted part here was what we asked for number three. And in this case, so he's going on with his closing statements, and he says this. He says, "To say it in another way, if white is always true and can decide anything over black, we would neither need a court which is designed especially for tribunal, nor a solemn and sacred trial like this." This was a little bit more difficult to see, but hopefully you kind of see that this is a bit of an if-then statement. That's something that we talked about in the original PowerPoint with logos, right? If-then statements are used a lot, right? You say, if this happens, then this happens. And while there's actually not a then here. This is kind of the middle of it, because he says, if white is always true and can decide anything over black, there's kind of this implied word here, then. Then we would neither need a court, blah, blah, blah. So even though there's not the actual word then there, this is still kind of an if-then statement. So this is just a very simple, basic, logical statement. He says, if this is true, then this is true, right? So this was definitely logos. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, but anytime you see one of those if-then statements, definitely an appeal to logos, an appeal to logic. All right, and then we move on to the second speech, which is probably the greatest speech ever given, for many, many, many different reasons, just for the impact it had. And if you've never seen this speech, I highly, highly recommend you go watch it. It's such a powerful speech. If you haven't seen it, you probably did at some point, probably maybe in 8th grade or something. But if you haven't seen it, we'll end up watching it next year in 10th grade, because we'll use this speech as we talk about some different rhetorical devices and stuff like that. Now, question 4, the first question for the speech, wasn't actually a quote from the speech. It was more so asking, hey, since Martin Luther King Jr., he has a doctorate, he's a minister, he's a civil rights leader, what do all these things kind of help in terms of the three rhetorical appeals? Hopefully this was obvious. That is definitely his ethos, right? Remember we said ethos is the trust, whether the speaker is trustworthy or credible. And just the fact that even before he begins speaking, Martin Luther King is this household name at this time. He is in the news. He is probably the biggest civil rights leader at the time he gave this speech. And those all just help his ethos, right? Everybody in this crowd is much more likely to believe him. It's also probably a more religious crowd in general, just because it was a lot of Southerners. People in the South during this time were very religious in general. And the fact that he uses all these religious analogies and refers to the Bible a lot, and also refers to American, ideals, I guess. Those all improve his ethos, right? It all are things that make him seem more reliable, more trustworthy, and it's just going to make the audience more likely to listen to him and believe him. So question 4 was definitely ethos. However, the rest of the speech is really just dripping with pathos. I mean, it is so much pathos. It's such a strong emotional appeal he makes here. So let's go through it. Question 5 was this highlighted quote here. It says, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. This is a very, very strong emotional appeal, right? This is definitely appealing to pathos. He's trying to, paint these images in people's minds of people coming together, joining hands as sisters and brothers. That's a very strong emotional appeal. It's trying to make you feel emotions of, I know it's almost like unity. I know that's not an emotion, but yeah, it's trying to make you picture happiness, hope, things like that. So definitely using some pathos here. And then the last question from that class or grade was this, and I really could have used any of these quotes, but he says, with this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. So yeah, this also as well was definitely pathos. Once again, he's really trying to pull on the heartstrings of his audience. He's really trying to make them feel these feelings of hope and unity and happiness and all these things. So definitely pulling hard on the pathos of the audience. And like I said, really throughout this whole speech, definitely using pathos more than anything. All right, so those are the answers. So if, just to recap real quick, number 1 was ethos, number 2 was logos, number 3 was also logos, number 4 was ethos, and number 5 and 6 were both pathos. If you're still confused by these, make sure you go back and rewatch my first video on rhetorical appeals. I try to lay it out as simply as possible. Be ready on the test to potentially come up with your own examples of it. Also, like you did with this, to identify examples from other things. And if you're confused, also, of course, email either me or Major Davis. We'd be glad to kind of talk you through it. We'll also talk about it some in our review days on either Friday or Monday, depending on which class you're in. Okay, thanks, guys.